Good evening, all, and welcome to the seventh lecture of the National Conference. Today we have Dr. Kalpana with us. Kalpana, as I contacted her, was asking me that since the conference title was about histories of Kerala, am I eligible to speak in the conference because I am from Tamil Nadu? And my response was that there are solidarities from across the border that could be forged, especially when we about women's histories. So there you are, Kalpana. Warm welcome. Moderator for today is Niranjana. She's an MPhil scholar of the department, and she's working on the histories of transport in colonial Kerala. Over to Niranjana for today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva ma'am. A very good evening and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for the 7th session of the 7-day online national conference conducted by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, in honor of Dr. Pasalathil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. The ongoing theme for this webinar is Critique and Constructions, Contemporary Writings on Histories of Kerala. This webinar provides a platform to interact with the new generation of historians and social scientists working on Kerala's past, bringing forward a revised version of existing assumptions and delving into fresh perspectives and conceptualizations. Today, we have with us one of the most distinguished scholar, Dr. Kalpana Karunakaran, who will be speaking on the topic Grandmother, Mother, Daughter, Writing Women's Lives. Before we move forward with the session, I'll be reading out a set of general instructions for the participants. All the participants are requested to mute their audio and turn off their video throughout the session. Attendance of the participants will be recorded automatically. If any of the participants accidentally leave and are unable to rejoin the session, they can continue with us through our live streaming in YouTube. Also, if you have any queries in between the session, please send them into the chat box or as comments in YouTube, and I'll read it to the speaker on your behalf at the end of the session. Without further ado, I invite our PG student Adhina Pidambaran to formally introduce Dr. K. Kalpana and for the welcome address. Over to you, Adhina.
Thank you, Niranjana, and a warm welcome to the 7th lecture of International Conference. It's indeed my pleasure to introduce the distinguished speaker, Dr. Kalpana Karunakaran, for the day, who is here to deliver the talk. Dr. Kalpana Karunakaran is Associate Professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department, IIT Madras. Her research area is Development Studies with a focus on the interface between gender and the development experience. Her academic publications are in the intersecting domains of gender, poverty, microcredit, women's work in the informal sector, women's trade unions, and collective action in solidarity economies. Her book, Women, Microfinance, and the State in Neoliberal India, was published by Routledge in 2017. She was an executive committee member of the Indian Association of Women's Studies for the period 2014 to 2017. As an activist or organizer with the People's Science Movement and the Tamil Nadu Science Forum, she has had extensive experience working among microcredit federations and right to health campaigns that included public audits of rural primary health centers and people's health status. She participates actively as resource person in workshops and campaigns for gender equality, labor rights, and human rights organized by women's movements, trade unions, and rural development NGOs. Welcome, ma'am, and we are delighted to have you with us. A warm welcome to all the participants to the lecture. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Before you begin, Kalpana, I see Professor Uma Chakravarti there. Hi, Uma. Warm welcome and deeply honored to have you with us in this session.
It's my honor to be here.
Hi, Geeta. Warm welcome, Geeta. Over to you, Kalpana.
Thank you, Shiba. Thank you, Adhina. Thank you for the very warm welcome. Geeta. There's also Dr. Vasanthi, former chairperson of the State Women's Commission, who has joined us today, and a very well-known educationist and a very passionate educationist from Tamil Nadu. So she's just turned her video off, but she was right here a second ago. So hello to her also. And
yes, honored.
So I was going to begin with two confessions. One of them is that my formal training, my academic discipline is not history. I do my research in the domain of what is called gender studies or women's studies more broadly. And also the second confession, as Shiba has already said, I don't usually work on Kerala, though I have PhD scholars whose work I supervise and who work on Kerala. But as Shiba reassured me, this is Dravida solidarity, so I belong here, and I'm so grateful to Shiba for inviting me for this conference. As it happened, when Shiba reached out to me and told me about this conference, I was working on, and I'm still working on, a book project that involves a family archive. This is the most fulfilling writing project that I have undertaken so far in my life. And it is also simply the most pleasurable writing I have ever done. I didn't know writing could feel so good. So that is what I'm going to be speaking about today. So let me begin with the first. I will be going on and off between screen share and back to the screen. So I hope all that works out well. And please let me know if it doesn't for some reason. Here is the title of my talk. Now, before I begin, if you could just look at the right side of the screen, just so that you get that particular family sequence in mind. There is Maithili, my mother. Well, I'm right there at the bottom. Maithili is
Have you started sharing, Kalpana? Have you started sharing your screen?
I forgot. Oh my God. This is... No, I haven't started screening. I'm looking at my PPT and I'm not sharing. Allow. Yeah, now I've started sharing. Is that okay? It's going to...
it's coming. It's coming on.
Just coming on, right? Yeah.
Yes. Now you're on.
Now I'm on. So please take a look at the right side of that screen. There's me right at the bottom. Maithili is my mother. Pankajam is Maithili's mother. And Subbalakshmi is Pankajam's mother, right? So Subbalakshmi is my great-grandmother. So just so that we don't get confused here with this. So I want to start with some preliminary questions. So I'll just keep the screen share on and then I'll keep going back. So I hope that's okay. I want to start with some preliminary questions. Why and when does a woman choose to tell the story of a female ancestor, a grandmother in this case, thus shining a light on family history? How does the writer approach her subject in a manner that reflects her conviction that the personal is inextricably political? And how does she write a biography that retains the distinctive singularity of an exceptional woman, even as it situates her in an all too familiar, unexceptional social universe? I'd like to answer this question by turning first to my mother, Maithili. Now, why do I turn to her? Because Maithili did a rather similar thing. In the early 2000s, she threw herself into research to write a book on her maternal grandmother, Subbalakshmi, who lived from 1897 to 1978. This piece of research eventually became a book of social history as it located its protagonist, Subbalakshmi, in her social milieu by recreating that period, drawing on a range of archival sources to do so. The book was published by Zuban in 2006. Here is the cover of the book. Some of you may have seen it. I hope some of you have seen it. Fragments of a Life, a Family Archive, published by Zuban in 2006. Here is a short excerpt from the foreword to the book, written by the writer, the novelist, Geeta Hariharan. This is also, in case you're interested, the foreword is also in the website of the Indian Cultural Forum. The book also inspired the historian Uma Chakravarti's film. It drew its material from Maithili's book on her grandmother, Fragments of a Life. The film was titled A Quiet Little Entry, And it is available for those who are interested to watch it. It's available on Vimeo. On the, I have the website URL here. So I'm just going to end the screen share. Right. So in this talk, I would like to revisit my mother's quest to reconstruct the life of her grandmother, Subbalakshmi, even as I share my current project, which is my book on my grandmother, Pankajam, which is what I am currently working on. That is Subbalakshmi's daughter. And at this point, I want to say a few words about my mother, Maithili, to set her quest for her grandmother in context. Maithili, or Maithili Sivaraman, as she was known, spent 4 decades of her life working full-time with the communist movement and the women's movement in Tamil Nadu. She was one of the first to have visited the site of the massacre of 44 Dalit agricultural laborers, mostly women and children, in Keel Venmani village of Tanjavur district in December 1968. It was through Maithili's writings on the social and political dimensions and the context of the massacre that many fully understood what had happened. She was also an active trade union organizer, leading some of the big industrial strikes in the city of Madras in the early 1970s. Maithili then headed and began to work with the women's organization Jananayaga Madar Sangam that she headed for some decades. And through the years of her organizing work, she wrote continuously in Tamil and English on patriarchy, caste oppression, class politics. So this was Maithili speaking, writing, organizing, and leading from the front. Screen share again. Maybe I should just keep screen share on all the time. So, yes, this is Maithili at a meeting in Madurai. This was during the emergency years between 75 and 77. Here is Maithili in the 1990s, left corner at a dharna. Yes. So in the early 2000s, when Maithili chose to carve out time consciously and to step back a little from her everyday activism to take up research for a book on her grandmother, Subbalakshmi, it was because she saw this new project as no less political than anything else she had done before. And because she felt it was important enough to justify setting aside some of her organizing work. And I can tell you, Maithili would not have done it otherwise. She felt that every minute of one's life must count for something. So why did she write the book? What motivated her? What drove her? I think the trigger was this. As a well-known public figure in Tamil Nadu, she was asked by a Tamil magazine sometime in the 1990s to name somebody, anybody, who had inspired her. And she found herself saying, my grandmother, Subbalakshmi. And the answer surprised her the most, that is Maithili the most. Maithili writes in the preface to her book, Subbalakshmi's name leaped out of my mouth without any conscious search for an icon. Maithili goes on to write, I always regretted not having a typical grandmother. Subbalakshmi did not feed her grandchildren, sing lullabies, rock them to sleep, cuddle them, or display affection of the usual grandmotherly kind. But to an adult Maithili, feminist and activist, a reticent, withdrawn grandmother, a recluse at ease only with her books, as Maithili writes in the preface, Subbalakshmi had become an enigmatic figure, a fascinatingly unconventional woman. And this is Maithili again in the preface to her book. My growing political and gender awareness made me sensitive to how Subbalakshmi and many others like her had fought with single-minded determination to get the most out of their warped lives. So Maithili realized, therefore, that she had to write the book as a way of coming to terms with a highly intelligent, deeply unhappy grandmother who simply refused to be contented with her assigned fate in life as a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. So, who was Subbalakshmi? Well, here she is. Now, screen. Yeah. Here she is. This is Subbalakshmi, 1897 to 1978, with 3 of her grandchildren. And this picture was taken in 1940. Right. Back. So she is not to be confused. I just want to say this at the outset. She is not to be confused with M.S. Subbalakshmi, the renowned classical singer, or Sister Subbalakshmi, who founded the Widows' Home and headed the Lady Willingdon School of Madras of those days, or any other well-known woman of those times. Santosh is asking photo, but I just showed the photo. I hope you could all see it. I shared the screen. She was...
Yes.
Yeah. Or any of the other well-known women of those times. She was a non-entity. She was not a famous person. She was born. I can show all the pictures again at the end. So I'll be able to do that again at the end, but I'll also show them in between. She was a non-entity. She was not a famous person. She was born in an Orthodox Tamil Brahmin household. Her father worked as a surveyor in the court of Travancore. Historically, Tamil Brahmins monopolized positions in the state bureaucracy on account of their access to education, colonial education, and employment in the British Raj. What happened in this case was Subbalakshmi's father, on account of his interaction with members of the court of Travancore, became highly impressed with women in the royal household of Travancore. He would say to his wife often, "They speak and read English so well. Why are our women not exposed to English education?" So his dream was to send his daughter to the Maharani's College of Mysore, which had just been upgraded as a college. But that was not to be. He died when Subbalakshmi was 4 years old in 1901. And his wife returned with her young children to her father's house in Tiruvayyaru, Tanjavur, in Madras Presidency. So a photo again. Let me show you this picture again. Somebody wanted to see it again. That is Subbalakshmi at the center with 3 of her grandchildren. Picture taken in 1940. And here is a picture that was taken possibly in 1900. Subbalakshmi here is a little girl in the skirt. She's a little girl in the bottom center of the picture. Her parents on either side of her and 2 of her brothers are also in the picture. So, as I said, her mother relocated with her children to her father's house in Tiruvayyaru, Tanjavur, in Madras Presidency. Subbalakshmi's life trajectory thereafter, after her father's death, was far removed from her father's dreams for her. She had little or no formal schooling. She was married at the age of 11. She went to live with her husband when she came of age at 13, and she had her first child at 14. By the age of 24, she had had 3 children and suffered loss and grief. She lost 2 of her 3 children to childhood illnesses, 1 little boy at age 5 and the other at 1.5. So here is, again, this is 14-year-old Subbalakshmi, who is pregnant. The baby would have been born in a few months after the picture was taken, with her 25-year-old husband. Picture was taken in 1911. This was also the cover picture for the book. So now this was not an unusual life story, perhaps, for a Brahmin woman of her times. As we know, the demands of caste purity dictated early marriage and stringent control of women of the dominant castes, when opportunities and the world were dramatically transforming for the men of their families, their brothers, husbands, sons. But what was remarkable about Subbalakshmi was that she was entirely self-taught from home and learned English by chance. as she had to read aloud the newspaper to her grandfather who was losing his eyesight. She grew up reading her older brother's school and college library books. So when she went to live with her husband at the age of 13, he was surprised to find that this young girl shared his interest in the English classics, poetry, and literature. But he was not comfortable with a wife who could match him intellectually and had a mind of her own. He was then working, Subbalakshmi's husband was then working with the colonial government in the Department of Salt and Customs. And this meant postings in small seaside towns with very little access to schools. Subbalakshmi therefore insisted that her only surviving child, her daughter Pankajam, must be sent to Madras where she could go to school. But her husband refused to allow this. So when he was away on one of his routine inspection tours of the salt pans, Subbalakshmi just up and left with her 10-year-old daughter to her brother's house in Madras and put the child in school explicitly against her husband's wishes. In Maithili's book, the chapter which describes this is titled... Sorry, is there a problem? I can hear somebody. Is it okay? Yeah.
Go ahead, Kalpana. There's some. It's okay.
I hope you can all hear me and occasionally see the pictures.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely fine. Go ahead.
Thank you. In Maithili's book, the chapter which describes this is titled Flight to Madras. For Subbalakshmi was then, and let us make no mistake about this, fleeing from her husband, with whom she had little in common. She lived 6 years in Madras when her daughter had a taste of school life. Now, how did Maithili approach her book? In her book, Maithili is unsparing in the critical gaze she brings to her family's history. For instance, she wonders if the conjugal relationship between 13-year-old Subbalakshmi and her 25-year-old husband at the start of the marriage could have been anything other than rape. Here, we may recall the historian Tanika Sarkar's paper on the child bride Phulmani of colonial Bengal, who was raped to death by her much older husband. Arguing his case, the defense lawyer for the husband wonders how many men present in the court were not also complicit in some way with the deep-rooted custom of cohabiting with a child bride, and sometimes a bride who had not even come of age, a pre-pubertal wife. So returning to Maithili's book, we must also keep in mind that it was her grandfather, that is Subbalakshmi's husband, that Maithili had adored as a child and who in turn had doted on her. Subbalakshmi was not easy to love. She could be admired from a distance. But as Maithili writes, much as I love him even today, my grandfather just happens to have played the role of an authoritarian husband. In the book, Maithili traces Subbalakshmi's dreams and ambitions and how they were thwarted, each one of them. When Subbalakshmi moved to Madras in 1921, those were the heady years of the non-cooperation movement. Her great desire and her early attempts to be a part of the anti-colonial struggle raging on the streets of Madras ended when her mother and brother, whom she was living with, restrained her, fearing they may cost Subbalakshmi's husband his job with the colonial government. As I had said earlier, he was working with the Department of Salt and Customs. In Madras, in 1924, Subbalakshmi had a chance meeting with 3 prominent women of the times from Bengal: Mrinalini Chattopadhyay, her sister Sarojini Naidu, and their sister-in-law Kamala Devi. Now, Mrinalini and Sarojini were sisters, and their brother, the artist Harindranath Chattopadhyay, was married to Kamala Devi. So Mrinalini and Kamala Devi struck up a friendship when they probably met Subbalakshmi at an exhibition, an art exhibition maybe in Madras. They saw her potential and they made an offer to Subbalakshmi. They said they would take her and her daughter Pankajam to live in Shantiniketan, the school founded by Tagore, where Pankajam could go to school and some useful occupation would be found for Subbalakshmi. Now, this prospect was hugely exciting for Subbalakshmi, who had by then developed a great love and reverence for Tagore. But this was also scuttled by her husband, by her mother and brother, who feared the wrath of Subbalakshmi's husband. She was, after all, in the custody of her mother and brother in Madras, in the absence of her husband. And as Maithili writes, how could they send away a married woman and her child without the knowledge or the consent of the husband? So this was Subbalakshmi's second dream that ended. The first being her great desire to be a part of the anti-colonial struggle. When Subbalakshmi's daughter Pankajam excelled in school, getting a double promotion twice, Subbalakshmi dreamt of making her daughter a doctor, so of educating her up to college. That dream too was shattered when Pankajam was withdrawn from school by her father even before she could complete class 9, to be married off a year later. So Maithili's book delves into Subbalakshmi's mental and physical illnesses, her fainting spells, her epileptic seizures, her hysteria, her remoteness, her withdrawal from social life and from people, her eccentricities and strangeness that made people around her think of her as mad. Through Subbalakshmi's life, Maithili asks, what is insanity? What constitutes normalcy? And how are these linked to social and gender oppression? She asks, that is, Maithili asks through her book, what is a woman like Subbalakshmi allowed to do and to be? And when she cannot do what she feels drawn to, what is the toll that it takes on her? So this is why Maithili, my mother, came to write on her grandmother, and this is how she approached it. Now, my story of writing about my grandmother, Pankajam, Subbalakshmi's daughter, began in the summer of 2017, so just a few years ago, when I finally found the time to take up a project I had been planning for a while, which was to start writing a full-length memoir or a biography on Maithili. The historian and writer Geeta, who is also with us today, and I had put together and edited a collection of Maithili's political essays some years earlier. And working with Geeta on this collection had been enormously important for me personally, as it inspired me and gave me the confidence to think that perhaps sometime in the future, I could attempt a proper political biography of Maithili. So let me just show you the cover of the book. This was the collection of essays of Maithili, Haunted by Fire, essays on caste, class, exploitation and emancipation, published in 2013 by Leftward. Incidentally, the cover picture shows Maithili along with the Gandhian Krishnammal Jagannathan standing next to her, the veteran Gandhian activist. So Maithili has been taken on her first visit to Kizhvenmani less than a week after the massacre. So this must have been the last week of December 1968. So in any case then, I was looking for material related to my mother in my house when I came upon a small wooden box that belonged to my grandmother, Pankajam. Now, I have always known I had this box and that it contained my grandmother's writings. I knew of her literary interests. I knew that she had written poems, essays, short stories that she had shared among family members. But I began to seriously peruse the contents of this box only in 2017, hoping to find some material on Maithili, my mother. So a screen share here. This was, by the way, a collection of her poems and short stories that my grandmother Pankajam had spiral bound and shared with her family members. So unpublished writings, essentially. And this I was aware of. I had my own copy. She gave each one of us a copy and so on. And so I was certainly not expecting to find what I did find in the wooden box. And this is what was surprising to me, which is autobiographical writing by Pankajam, all in English, some of which, a little bit of which I was familiar with, but most of which I had simply no idea of until then. So when reading Pankajam's account of her own life, this is Pankajam writing about her own life, I was immediately struck by the vivid and evocative manner in which she narrates the story of a girl child growing up in the second decade of the 20th century amidst salt pans in small seaside towns along the Coromandel coast in Madras Presidency. Pankajam was born in November 1911 when, as I said, her mother was 14 years old. In Pankajam's writing on her early years, we see a child's eye view of the world of adults, of women, men, and domestic arrangements. In superb prose, she describes the aching loneliness of bleak and barren landscapes of the salt pans, occasionally punctuated by a sudden burst of vegetation. And this segues seamlessly into a depiction of her mother's, Subbalakshmi's, melancholia. Pankajam reflects tenderly and thoughtfully on how the unexpressed sorrows and disappointments of adults nevertheless influence the psychosocial development of children. So at this point, another picture. This is once again Subbalakshmi on the right corner. Next to her is her infant son, one of the two children she lost. And in the white dress, in that little white dress, is Pankajam, who must have been about 4 years old then. So here is the picture. Even when Pankajam is writing of events that took place several decades ago, her prose resonates with dramatic tension and conveys a sense of immediacy and urgency. She makes us feel the mute sorrow of a 5-year-old whose mother suddenly disappears for several months and whom she cannot speak about to her father. She cannot even ask him if her mother is dead. We feel the helpless terror of a 6-year-old who sees her father raining blows on her mother. We suffer with 7-year-old Pankajam when she recounts the events that led to her brother's death, even as she hints at the subtly different ways that grief and loss leave their imprint on adults and children. We rejoice with Pankajam when, as a lonely child of 8 years who has just lost her younger brother and devoted playmate, she embraces a world of horses and dogs, insects and birds, and more occasionally other children when chance encounters in the seaside towns bring her new friendships. Pankajam's writing evokes the wonder, curiosity, and natural delight with which a free-spirited child explored her habitat, running wild, climbing trees, riding horses, seeking out adventures that included snakes and jackals, and constructing imaginary universes. What struck me as quite remarkable was the complete absence of restraint on her movements and her person, and the freedom she had to inhabit physical space outside and beyond the household. But for all her zest and enthusiasm for life, Pankajam is conscious that she is growing up in a household riven by conflict. Although she does not say it in so many words, her narrative suggests a child's unhappy awareness of being a pawn in her parents' competing visions of a life and a future for her. It seems to be a spirit of defiance that drives 8-year-old Pankajam to take matters into her own hands by learning and making swift progress in Telugu when her parents battle over whether she must learn English or Sanskrit. In Pankajam's account of her 6 eventful years in Madras, in her uncle's household in the 1920s, this is the flight to Madras from Maithili's book, the streets of Triplicane come alive because she lives in Triplicane. And so do political meetings and gatherings on the Marina Beach. This was Pankajam's first experience of school, and she shows us how schooling built her sense of herself as a person of some worth. Homeschooled until the age of 10 by her mother, Pankajam's sense of herself, reinforced by others, by family's judgment of her, was that she was, I quote, a dull, unwilling scholar, a daydreamer, a disobedient good-for-nothing, growing up in a household of geniuses. Pankajam movingly writes, I discovered myself only at school, and my people also began to have faith in me. The world of school friends, sports, and games ended in 1927 when her father withdrew her from school in the middle of class 9, even before she could complete class 9, despite her loud protests and her tears. Pankajam then vows to herself that she will somehow study from home and become equal to the educated. An opportunity for this develops soon after, when she returns with her parents to the coastal town of Marakkanam. At the age of 16, her father gifts her 12 volumes of the Book of Knowledge. So this was like the Encyclopedia Britannica of that period. It had history, geography, geology, literature, biology, astronomy, physics, chemistry, mathematics. So here is, at this point, I just want to show you this. 16-year-old Pankajam. This was around the time she was withdrawn from school in order to be married off. And the person right behind her is her father. This picture must have been taken in 1928. Now, Pankajam writes, and this is a direct quote from Pankajam's autobiographical writing, I must tell you what the books, those 12 fat volumes, did to me. They were my school, my college, and the very world for me. I read them again and again, and knowledge made me a woman. So I have a section in my book, in my manuscript, it's still a manuscript, titled Becoming a Woman. Now, while the title may suggest to somebody who just sees the title that it is about her coming of age, her first experience of menstruation, maybe puberty rites, rituals, how her family responded, it's about none of that. It is all about her first encounter when she was 16 with the 12 fat volumes of the Book of Knowledge and what it meant to her and how, in a sense, it laid out before her the path she knew she must take in her life, which is to continue her education outside of school and college. So here was Pankajam, withdrawn from school at 16, married at 17, her first child born at 19, and thereafter a new baby every 2 years for the next 10 years of her life. She had 5 children, and fortunately for her, all 5 of them survived. As she would often jokingly say, the decade of the 1930s were the years she had one baby on the hip and the other in the belly. Here is Pankajam. This must have been 1935. 3 of her children are born, and the third is still an infant, 2 more to come. But Pankajam was always also aspiring to have a rich life of the mind, to a manorajyam. This is a phrase that Pankajam uses in a Tamil story that she writes some years later. Manorajyam can be translated as a kingdom of the mind, a phrase she uses in a Tamil story that she writes several years later. I just want to show you an extract, a translated extract. I translated this from the Tamil. This is from her short story, Vidiyum Madiyum, which means fate and intelligence. Can the rejects of society, enjoy anything other than a kingdom of the mind? It is only in this kingdom that they may gallivant with freedom and autonomy. The minds of those who do not inhabit this kingdom are but a dry desert. Without it, a mind full of ideals and ambitions will shrink, lose faith in itself, and lose its way in this barren world. The tender sapling of confidence can be rescued from the desert's scorching heat only if it is watered and nourished by the kingdom of the mind. So I want to, at this point, give you a sense of the material I have at hand so that you understand this better. Her autobiographical writing that maps different phases of her life is not a single, continuous, unbroken piece of writing. She began to write in 1949 when she was 38 years old. She wrote on and off for close to 50 years. The last bit of writing she did was in 1995 when she was about 84 years. And she, in fact, continued to write for a few months after she had a stroke, a brain hemorrhage, and then stopped writing. She died in 2007. So 1949 to 1995, right? So this is what I mean by approximately 50 years. The month or the year of the writing is never there. So I have to read closely and establish the date. And how do I do this? She says, when she talks about a particular incident, she says, although it has been 30 years, it remains as fresh in my memory as if it was yesterday. So then I know when she was writing this, and so on. Even now, when I'm 75 years old, she begins another section. So I know when she's writing this section. So this is my clue. All her autobiographical writing is in English. I must add this. She explains in her foreword, and she has a foreword that she writes in 1949. So she explains in her foreword that she writes in English, a language that is not her own, in which she does not think during the stress and strains of her life, I'm quoting, and which is not at all the proper medium to express subtle thoughts, her writing again. Yet she writes in English so that her friends, including her Telugu-speaking best friend from school, may read and understand her. In her foreword, she reflects on why she is writing about her life, who is she writing for, and how dare she write when she has accomplished nothing. So this is how Pankajam describes herself and her life in her foreword. 5 children. This section was written, the foreword. The first section was written in 1949. 5 children, their children, cows in the shed, managing a household, and nursing and looking after my old and ailing parents kept my nose tied to everyday mundane things. She writes, I'm not a woman of our time of national struggle. She's writing this in 1949. I'm not a poet, nor a writer, a great social worker, or even a society lady. I am a humble housewife tied to mundane work. In Tamil, she calls herself a Sarva Sadharana Kudumba Penmani. Yet, she is conscious that she is a subject of history and has a story that is worth telling. She writes, housework always keeps the soul fettered down. But why then I should write this is to show how my soul has been ever trying to soar up and break the bondage of the flesh. In her foreword, Pankajam reminds us that she is no Mahatma Gandhi who can claim to lay bare everything that has happened in her life, to rip open the heart, she writes, as Gandhi does. Now, Pankajam's pointed reference to Gandhi makes me wonder whether a woman may ever speak the truth and rip open the heart on all matters of her life, public and private. I know that Pankajam must have grappled with these questions in some form, and the way she speaks of matters of conjugal life and intimacy is through fiction. There are 3 stories written by her. These stories describe the lives of their protagonists. Maybe I should stop presenting. Yeah. There are 3 stories written by her. These stories describe the lives of their protagonists, Meena, Kamala, and Lakshmi. Meena is married to Subbu, Kamala is married to Sundaresan, and Lakshmi is married to Ramanathan. Now, just to clarify, these are 3 different stories written at different points of time in her life. 1 story in Tamil and 2 in English. In these stories, Meena is on the verge of marriage in her story, while Kamala in her story has just been married and embarked on conjugal life. Pankajam stays for the longest period of time with Lakshmi, taking the story to the years that Lakshmi's 5 children become teenagers. Now, these stories are very thinly veiled autobiographical accounts. The stories reveal that a young Pankajam had evidently yearned for a husband who would share her ideals and dreams, her love of books, her thirst for knowledge, and her passion to know the world better. We know from histories of this period that male social reformers of the middle classes and the upper castes in colonial India sought wives who were sufficiently educated to be companionate partners. We see this, for instance, in Uma Chakravarti's description of the relationship between Ranade of Maharashtra, the reformer, and his much younger wife, Ramabai, whom he sought to educate, modernize, and make of her his companion. Now, Pankajam's case reverses this gendered logic, for knowledge had made her a woman, and she sought nothing less than a companionate partner for herself. But this was not to be. The three stories of these three young women enable Pankajam to lay bare the unraveling, the swift falling apart of her own marriage. They make it possible for her to narrate the story of a failed conjugality, and the literary device of the story gives her a form to say the unsayable. These stories and Pankajam's autobiographical writings, reading them together, show me how Pankajam, who sought desperately hard but failed to redefine conjugality, succeeded very well in redefining motherhood. She made her children in her image. The stories show us how she salvaged and redeemed domesticity by co-creating with her children a universe of emotional intimacy and intellectual curiosity, even if she could not rework the terms of her marriage. They show us how she fiercely cultivated an independent sense of self, carrying on with her life as if her husband did not matter a bit. They also show us, both her autobiographical writing and her stories, I'm talking about both now, they also show us the cost to her of sustaining a troubled, conflict-ridden marriage through her adult years. While Pankajam had before her the model of her mother Subbalakshmi, who retreated from people and relationships in the face of her disappointments and suffering, Pankajam chose another path. In fact, the precise opposite. She sought them out, people and relationships, with great vigor and engaged with the world robustly, seeking to make sense of its perplexities. Now, I would like to reflect on the methodology that I employ for the book on Pankajam and that Maithili did for her book on Subbalakshmi. The sources Maithili drew upon for her book on Subbalakshmi have given historians valuable insights into how to reconstruct a life, as the historian Uma Chakravarti writes in her afterword to Maithili's book. Maithili's sources were library lists of books borrowed by Subbalakshmi, receipts of books bought, news clippings of writings and speeches from newspapers and journals, and receipts of donations made to the Indian national, her social world, her life, her times. And so my sources are multiple. Her autobiographical writing, in which she makes it clear that this is a first-person account of her life. The three stories that are a fictionalized account of her life. Her long essay, she has a long essay on the city of Madras, the social life of Madras from the 1920s to the 1940s. Her correspondence, letters she wrote to her adult children in life when they flew the nest and resettled in different parts of the world, the letters they wrote to her and that other friends wrote to her. Now, I just want to mention that there were three friends with whom she maintained a special and long-lasting correspondence: a British woman who was a traveler, a world traveler and an adventurer, Paxi Thornhill, a Russian scholar of Tamil studies, Alexander Dubyansky, and a Tamil Christian woman from Nazareth, Tirunelveli, Grace Samuel, wife of the Reverend Samuel. In terms of, there's one more bit about the correspondence that I want to talk about a little bit. In particular, between 1963 and 1968, for those 6 years, her youngest child, Maithili, my mother, was studying and then working in the US. During this period, Pankajam wrote Maithili regularly, no less than 3 letters a month. And Maithili never lost or threw away a scrap of paper in her life. So very fortunately, I have most of Pankajam's letters to Maithili during this period, 63 to 68. Now, why did Pankajam write as many letters as she did? Letter correspondence was an important means to keep alive her emotional and intellectual connection with those who mattered to her. Her letters to Maithili are packed with anecdotal vignettes of daily life, the daily rhythms of her household, and the occasional convulsions in that rhythm, her clear-sighted observations of social relationships around her, her ruminations on the meaning of life, usually triggered by rite of passage events such as the death of someone close to her, and underlying it all, her sense of herself as a traveler puzzling out the riddle of life, as she writes in the foreword to her autobiography. She also sees this as the reason she must have an autobiography. She's asking herself, what is the meaning of this life? Pankajam's letter writing enabled her to undertake what we may see as an ethnography of the self. Her letters, no less than her autobiographical writing, reflect her deep interest in herself as a subject of history, making sense of life's vicissitudes and unpredictable twists and turns. I also rely for this manuscript, I also rely on my ongoing interviews with my extended family. These include Pankajam's firstborn child, my uncle, who's now 90. My extended family has been warmly supportive of my venture, just as they were of Maithili's book several years earlier. I draw on my memories of conversations about Pankajam with my mother, Maithili, who has lost her own memories. And, of course, my memories, I draw on my memories of being raised by Pankajam. She raised me as much as my parents did. This is because Maithili, in her adult married years, shared a household with her mother Pankajam, just as I, in my adult years, continue to share a household with my mother Maithili. This is the last screen share. This is the three of us standing before the house that Pankajam built. There's a story to how Pankajam built that house.
The slide. The slide, please.
Yes. Thank you, Shiba. Oh, no. I mean, the screen share. I'm so sorry. Yes, present now and entire screen. Oh, God, this thing is so difficult to do. Yes, allow and then the... Allow, so is it, yeah.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So this is the three of us standing before the house that Pankajam built. And there's a section in my book on the house that Pankajam built and the social circumstances and familial arrangements that allowed her to actually successfully build a little house. The three of us there's Maithili in this corner, Pankajam in the middle, and I'm in the right corner. This is also the household that we shared for several years of her life, that Maithili shared with her mother in her adult life. Yes. So while I rely on these memories and family stories, I am conscious that I am recreating a life through my interpretive frameworks. And therefore, in writing this book, I show my hand to the reader. That is, I'm juxtaposing these different sources always. Her letters, her correspondence, her short stories, her autobiographical writing, her daily diaries, etc., interviews, my memories, and so on. I juxtapose these different sources so that I justify why I think she felt this, why I think she acted this way. The reader is also free to interpret and challenge the way I read and present her life. And if I am on thin ground, I admit that I am on thin ground. I'm speculating. Writing this manuscript is no less challenging than any other piece of writing and research that I have taken up before this, which is in gender and development, my domain of research. While it is research that informs this exercise, I must admit that when I write this manuscript, I feel the difference in a stark way, in a visceral way almost, because I am able to lay aside the conventions of formal academic writing, the protocol, the constant referencing that all of us are familiar with, and that can feel like a straitjacket too. And I must say that to be able to lay that aside and write somewhat differently does feel liberating. It is finally then, and I'm finishing here, a piece of writing that I did not intend to do. It was entirely unintentional. I wanted to. I started to do a book on my mother, but found myself writing on my grandmother instead. When I read her foreword and heard her voice, so self-assured, strident almost, on why she will not be silenced, even if she has accomplished nothing in the world, even if she is a woman of no consequence, I knew right then that I had no choice. So here I am, walking the path my mother did, seeking my grandmother and dreaming of her, just as my mother Maithili did a decade and a half ago. I thank you for including me in this conference, and I'm honored to be speaking at a history conference, more so because I'm not a historian. And thank you, Shiba, for inviting me. And thank you all for listening to me. And I look forward and be very happy to have your thoughts and your reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the session, ma'am. Transgressing the borders of history and delving into the realms of gender and family archives. Reading through the lines that link and delink the personal and political in being and becoming a woman, it was deeply engaging and thoroughly insightful to listen to you. The session is now open for queries and discussion.
Well done, Kalpana. After a long time, I'm meeting you. Ajit speaking, your friend from JNU. Fantastic presentation. Quite. I'm moved by the kind of the methodology that you followed minutely. Have they written everything in? They must have scribbled quite a lot of letters, right? Those days, I remember my grandfather writing Chiranjeevi, Kannan, something. It goes on and on. Then he'll say Nalarkiya, Nalamari Aval. Then the next line, I start understanding the Tamil. The Tamil of my grandfather. I'm sure we both belong to the same generation. Did they write everything in Tamil and English mix both?
No, her letters, Ajit, her letters were all in English. Her letters were all in English to her children. It depended on who she was writing to. If she was writing to her children, it was in English. If she was writing to relatives of her generation, her kith and kin, it was in Tamil. So I have her letters both in English and in Tamil. Many of the letters to her children through the 1960s and 70s were all in English.
So you had less difficulty in writing the book in English?
Perhaps, maybe so. But there are sufficient sources in Tamil also for me to handle. And it's not difficult at all. In fact, I quite enjoy it. So
you can project those Tamil letters and English letters. I want to see that handwriting.
I have to first scan them, Ajit.
Next time. No, next time maybe when you go.
In fact, I wondered if I should scan and then also show some of the writing, but I didn't know too many. I don't know how to structure the screen share alternation with this, and whether I should actually also be scanning at this stage her writing directly from English in her stories and so on, just to give you a sense of the writing and whether that would be interesting to do in this presentation. So I was in two minds and I ended up not doing that.
Now, since your book is based on all those correspondences, the letters and other, modes of communication, since you projected some of the fine photographs, beautiful photographs, it reminded me of my grandmother's and father's photographs. So I thought you would show some of their writings also. I was just curious to see them. Yeah. Ma'am, unmute. Uma, ma'am.
Uma, your mic.
Uma,
your mic.
Uma, you have to.
Yeah.
Oh dear, Uma,
your mic is mute.
Your mic.
All right, got it. Did that. No, I'm actually reminded of the discussion we had, even in Subbalakshmi's case, after the film would be screened and otherwise when there was a discussion, this question would often come up about writing in Tamil or writing in English. And the interesting thing is that Maithili and Subbulakshmi wrote to each other in English. They did not write to each other in Tamil. And even though Subbulakshmi was self-schooled rather than, she never went to a formal school, the reading actually was very wide. It's not that she didn't read Tamil and that she was not moved by Tamil, because so much of her relationship to poetry and to music and so on was tied up with Tamil. But there is an interesting way in which English is positioned at that stage in the emerging life of women who had access to it, because it gave them, the reading was really that much wider. You know, I mean, like, for instance, reading Tagore is being done in English. There's a new set of people emerging. And I think that's an interesting thing. We need to think about this in non-judgmental terms. You know, it isn't to do with the fact that it's a hiding of the self. I think it's a way in which the self has expanded, and it depends on who you're corresponding with. And as you pointed out, Pankajam's friend is Telugu. So how will she communicate with her except through English? So English has a place there, which is, I think, interesting. And it was a really great presentation. I'm saying Maithili to you. Kalpana, it was fantastic because you've positioned it so well. Very nice. I really liked it.
Thank you, Ma. Thank you so much.
Niranjana, if you could start off with the questions. There are a few questions in the chat box, Kalpana. Niranjana, read it out to you.
Oh, yes, sure.
Sure, ma'am.
I can see them. I think the first question, the first question is
from Swarna Suresh.
Yeah, maybe Niranjana can read it out. Yeah, I don't know which is the.
Niranjana, please do.
Yes, the first question is from Swarna Suresh. I shall read out the question. What parallels can be drawn in the writings of Tanika Sarkar on the autobiography Amar Jiban Akka My Life by Rasundari Devi and your biographical work? She's a student from... she's a student from university.
This is something that I haven't yet worked on, Swarna. I hope my mic is unmuted. Yeah. In terms of, I'm still sort of gathering all this material together and sort of writing the life story itself. But in terms of locating it with respect to other autobiographies, some of which may be from a slightly earlier period also. Pankajam's sort of story begins really from 1911. But that is a venture that I really haven't looked at so far. But I certainly will do it. It's not something I will leave out, but it's not something that I'm in a position to answer you at this stage of the manuscript writing. So I can see the next question by my friend Parashar. He's asking, he's curious about how Madras city appears in her eyes. It's a beloved city. It's the city that expanded her world and her mother's world in the 1920s. In fact, she writes in her autobiography, the most happy and successful years of my life were the 6 years I spent in school in Madras. So for her, Madras then is, initially it's schooling in the Lady Willingdon School, which is on the beach. So she has this fantastic descriptions of the school itself, of school life. She has very rich ethnographic description. It's almost like a trained anthropologist is writing, on street performances, folk performances, on street life in Madras, the shops, the bustling city life that she finds around her. And she's also always part of that narrative. So although she's writing about the city, you know where she's shopping for her children, where she's buying books, where she can buy actually secondhand books with the little money that she has, where she can buy cheaper chocolates for her children, and all of that. So in a sense, it's also the city as experienced through a more intimate, very personal narration of city life. And it's also the years of the Second World War and what it does to the city, the bombing of Madras by the Japanese, the great panic that overtook the good citizens of Madras, all of whom fled from Madras, and how hers was probably one of the few families that remained in Madras during that period. And she talks about how she could hear the lions roaring in the zoo from Egmore, quite a distance from where she was. And it's the kind of silence she had never heard before, although she grew up in seaside towns. So she has, therefore, this very vivid way in which she presents city life and makes the city come alive for us. And so that's also going to be a constant reference that I'm drawing on. Thanks for that question, Paro. Thank you so much. And thank you, Subairat. Thank you, Bindu. Thank you, Santosh. There's Geeta, Shobha. Sitara says, Gandhi has been hailed as the person who brought a lot of women into movements. How have his ideas influenced the life of Subbalakshmi, who was born and brought up in an orthodox family, but later challenged conservative notions of Indian society? I would say Gandhi, yes, but Gandhi and also Subbalakshmi was a woman whom, and I didn't have the time to say this in my talk, but Subbalakshmi was a woman who read enormously and very, very widely. So as it happened in the 1920s, when she stays in Madras, what she does is to become a member of the university, Madras University Library, which is quite unusual because library membership was restricted to students and scholars, and Subbalakshmi was neither. She wasn't even formally schooled in that sense. But when she goes to the library and interacts with the librarian, she sees immediately that this is a very unusual woman with a great passion, a great hunger for books, and he gives her membership of the Madras University Library. So she's reading Buddhism, she's reading the histories of Buddhism, she's reading Gandhi, and she's reading Tagore, she's reading psychoanalysis by Einstein. Psychoanalysis by Freud. She's reading Relativity by Einstein. She's reading Edgar Snow's Red Star over China. So all of this is part of her reading. So all of this is feeding into the woman that she is, that she becomes. So it's not only Gandhi, I must say, but it's, of course, she's also deeply inspired by the black flag waving protests in the streets of Madras in 1922, when the Prince of Wales arrived, and he was met with a sea of black flags by Congress and general people on the streets of Madras, and Subbalakshmi was one of them. So she's also very much shaped by the spirit of the times, moved by the spirit of the times. So thank you, Kala. Swarna says, Swarna Suresh, women's studies are historicized with the aspects of the private and public. How have you addressed the spatial transition of women from the private to the public sphere in your biographical writing? That's a very interesting question. Subbalakshmi never quite made that spatial transition, and Pankajam makes it within the confines of family life. So in that sense, the transition to the public is not through either education or through employment. So it's not the conventional routes of transition into the public domain. It is not through involvement in the national struggle. It is not through involvement in social activism or community activism. So it is not through any of those perhaps more conventional routes that Pankajam straddles the private and the public. Pankajam does it differently. And the way she does it, for one thing, she does it is through just intensive learning and reading about the world outside her, like her mother, but she far exceeds her mother, I must say. For one, she has more access to books. She lives all the time in Madras. And for another, after her marriage also. And for another, she's just a person in better physical health. She has far more stamina for the things she wants to do in her life. So therefore, the way in which I would say her mind, her world expands is through her constant reading. I remember my grandmother when she was in her mid-80s and my friends would come home, she would bring out her copy of Stephen Hawking and would ask them if they would discuss it with her. Were they interested in physics? Would they discuss physics with her? So that was her. So I don't therefore see her as confined within the domestic space. And she also had opportunities to travel and see the world because of her children working in different parts of the world. And she was a traveler. She was not a grandmother who was babysitting grandchildren. When she traveled. She saw the USSR. She visited the USSR. She visited some parts of Africa. She would read about it. She would carry books. She would read about the flora and the fauna. She would write. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to say. She would write extensive travelogues, travel diaries. I have notebooks filled with her travelogues of places visited, of people, of flora, of fauna, of how it changes her as a person. So within those spaces that she had, I must say that she's traveled the public-private divide fairly well, remarkably successfully, I must say. Mahmood, thank you very much, Mahmood. Number of biographies on women are written by both men and women. How do they differ in a gender perspective? I don't know if you have any particular biography on women written by men in mind, Sitara, because nothing comes to my mind now. And I also don't think I am qualified to comment in this sweeping way on biographies written by women versus biographies written by men. I don't also think I'm qualified to comment on that, so I will pass that question. Thank you, Rekha. Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much. Akhil, I would like to question, do you think it would be a challenge to attempt a similar one with regard to communities with less privilege? Also would like to ask, does these letters refers to the life of people belonging to lower caste? No, it doesn't, Akhil. Actually, when I mean her letters, I mean the letters she wrote, as in letter writing, that she wrote to her family members. So she would be writing to her daughter, Maithili. She would be writing to her son who lived in Canada. She would be writing to her son in Bombay. She would be writing to, or she would be receiving letters from the scholar Alexander Dubiansky, from Patsy Thornhill, from Grace Samuel. So that's what I mean by the letters, right? So I don't, that's not, they don't refer, no. So she's not making references to vastly different social or economic contexts in these letters, simply because she has no knowledge of them, right? Her knowledge of the world is still largely a bookish knowledge of the world. In fact, it is through the letters her children write her that her knowledge of the world expands about other parts of the world that she doesn't travel to and that she reads about through their letters. So their letters are also a window to worlds that she does not inhabit. And she does not write about worlds that she does not know either, right? Although she does express the great desire to be allowed to step out of her house to more actively engage with questions of poverty within her city itself. There's some reflection on that in her letters, but she does not have the means to do so, and she does not have the permission to do so. As a married woman, she has little or no control over her movements for almost all her adult years until her husband passes away much later in life. Varsha, thank you for that question, Akhil. Varsha, could you speak a bit about the challenges you faced in this particular project, as it is quite different from your domain? It's different in some ways. I find it's not so different in some other ways, Varsha. So, Varsha, hi, Varsha. That's my student. Okay. Okay, I didn't realize that. So, yeah. So it's not different in some ways, and some of the ways in which it is not different is that some of the literature in gender and development that I am dealing with, that I am reading about, etc., talks a lot about women's negotiations within the household, right? So it talks about how women are contesting and challenging patriarchies, male kin control of their lives, but in the context of their everyday life. So it is not a rupture with marriage. It's not a breakdown of the marital contract. It's not an exit from a marriage. It's not voting with their feet by walking out of a situation in which they are deeply unhappy, as Pankajam was, as Subbalakshmi was, right? But so while it is living with and occupying that space, it is about seeing how they can wrest meaning out of every opportunity in life that they get. There is literature in gender and development that also speaks to some of these concerns that I am exploring in a more personal way and with much richer material in this manuscript on Pankajam's life. So I think I would say that this is the overlap or the link that I can see between the two. Thank you, Varsha, for your question. Neetu, could you please explain the women's movements participated by Maithili and what was the nature? Neetu, I can't get into very much detail. Maithili was part of and heading the Democratic Women's Association. She was one of the founding members along with others. There was KP Janaki Ammal, Papa Umanath, Maithili Sivaraman. These were the names from that period, from say 1974 onwards, or even 73, end 73, when the Democratic Women's Association was formed in Tamil Nadu, a few other states. In 1981, I think it became the All India Democratic Women's Association, also known as the AIDWA, the AIDWA. it continues to be a very vibrant organization in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu. And this was the organization that Maithili was also very deeply involved with until about 2004 to 2005, when she withdrew on account of reasons of poor health. But some of her other political writings, if you are interested, you can also find it in the book Haunted by Fire, which brings together those writings. Thank you, Dr. Susan. Thank you, Salina, Shiba, Shivdas, Leena. Look forward to reading. Can you give us some idea of how Pankajam made her Telugu, Russian and Christian friends? For sure, her Telugu best friend is from school. So those 6 years she's in school, she is then brought into, connection with. And interestingly, one of the girls was her classmate and a friend of Pankajam was also Captain Lakshmi. I think all of you have heard of Lakshmi Sehgal, who went on to become to lead the Rani Jhansi regiment of Subhash Chandra Bose, and then came back and became a doctor and worked several years in Uttar Pradesh as a doctor running a clinic. So Captain Lakshmi was also one of Pankajam's classmates in the Lady Willington College and Training School. That was what the school was called. Sadly, the school is in a state of complete ruins now. But Pankajam's friends outside of family can date back to the period she was in school. She meets Patsy Thornhill in a very interesting way. She actually meets her at a religious discourse given by Swami Chinmayananda, then of that period of the 1950s. And Patsy and Pankajam Patsy was just a complete free spirit. She's a woman who drove a van she's a British woman. She drove it all through Central Asia, through many parts of Europe, all by herself in that van. And then she drove through Afghanistan, through Pakistan, through North India, and then she came to India. So when Pankajam met Patsy, here she was, a fairly wild woman, single, unattached, or maybe she had a relationship, a woman who smoked, etc. This was the early 1950s. Anybody else may have found her rather strange and quite difficult to deal with. But at first sight, Pankajam seems to have fallen in love with Patsy, went up to her at the meeting and said, "I like you very much. I want to know you better. Please come home and meet my children." And that's how Pankajam and Patsy became friends. And Patsy over the years would write letters to Pankajam in which he would call her my dear little Indian mother. So there was quite that age difference. She met Dubiansky, who's a well-known scholar and who in fact very sadly passed away from COVID recently, only a couple of months ago in Russia, in the Soviet Union then, when she went to stay with her son Ramachandran, who was then working with Air India. So that's how she gets the chance to travel, is always because she has her children somewhere. So then she's able to afford that financially also, that little bit of travel. So in Russia then, through her son Ramachandran, she meets Dubiansky and she renames him Alex Chandran because his name is Alexander Dubiansky. So like Ramachandran, he becomes another son to her. And then he visits her, he stayed at our home. He stayed with Pankajam on his many visits to India, to Madras. And he's also written to her, and interestingly, as Uma was saying, all his letters to Pankajam are in Tamil. All of them are in Tamil. And all her letters to Dubiansky, I'm sure, were also in Tamil. Incidentally, I've written a piece on this unusual friendship between Dubiansky and Pankajam, which I hope the Caravan will carry in the month of May. So I've sent it to them, and I hope to see it in print in May, and I'll share it with you. Nisha, familiar with Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. I'm familiar with her other work, but not this, Nisha. But thank you for that reference. Thank you for that reference. Thank you, Nisha, Sitara. Thank you, Varsha, and Kala, everybody. Thank you all. I think I've taken most of your questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering all the questions. It was indeed a wonderful discussion. And a heartfelt word of gratitude to all the distinguished guests who joined with us for the evening. Now, I would like to invite our MPhil scholar, Nitin A., for the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Niranjana, and a very good evening to all. Today, we have been enlightened by the erudite lecture on grandmother, mother, daughter, writing women slaves by Dr. Kalpana Karunakaran. Her scholarly argument and views on the lives of women and the way they are written have elevated us to a new scholarship On behalf of everyone, I take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude to you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Most importantly, it is the presence of an active audience that gave life to this discussion, and I thank each and everyone present here for my heart for being a part of this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kalpana. It was a fabulous presentation. You had everything in there, from the data to the frame to the critique of the discipline. Everything was there. It was fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you, Uma, for being here. Thank you, Geeta. Thank you all else. Thank you all the participants for being here. We meet again tomorrow, same time, 6 p.m. for the 8th lecture by Dr. Manu Devadevan. Thank you all. Bye.